The dawn of the 20th century. Canada is changing in ways never imagined. The population explodes, and almost half of Canadians live in urban centers. But growth comes at a cost. Deadly diseases plague our cities. Labor strikes lead to violent conflict. And organized crime takes root. Through boom times and bust, we struggle to improve our lives and learn to care for others. United to celebrate a new Canadian spirit. We are explorers, risk-takers, and dreamers, fighting the odds in a land of extremes. Across a vast continent, we build a nation. Truly strong and free. Spring 1911. Industrialization sweeps across Canada. With new technologies, bustling factories, and the latest in transportation, including the automobile. There are now more than 20,000 cars on Canadian roads. In 20 years, there will be over 1 million. To keep them moving, the search for oil becomes the new gold rush. Although the North American oil industry starts in Ontario, by 1911, most petroleum is being imported from the United States. But in the Turner Valley, 45 kilometers southwest of Calgary, that's about to change. Stuart Heron came here from Ontario 6 years ago to start a new life.
When Stuart Heron came to the West, he was an entrepreneur. He was looking for opportunities. He was a farmer, raised horses, delivered coal.
At this farm in the foothills, Heron smells a familiar odor. As a young man, he visited the oil fields of Pennsylvania. He recognizes the smell of crude oil.
In the Canadian West, the petroleum industry was in its infancy. All oil products had to be imported from the States or from central Canada, say Ontario. So people were looking for petroleum.
Heron makes his way to a small pool. But this liquid isn't black like crude oil. It's clear as water, hinting at an oil reserve down below. There's only one problem. He doesn't own this land. Heron sends a sample of the liquid to universities in Pennsylvania and California. The reports confirm it is gas condensate, gases from underground petroleum reserves that turn into liquid once they hit the surface. Supporting Heron's theory that there could be a large deposit of oil underground.
He was obviously very excited because this was the find, and there had been rumors that there were enormous resources there. And he knew that oil was what would power the 20th century.
To buy the land from the owner, he sells his beloved farm, gambling everything he has on his instincts.
He wasn't a rich man himself. He had to buy a drilling rig. He had to bring in drillers to drill, which meant he had to get investors.
He convinces prominent Calgarians to finance the drilling operation for the well, including Archibald Dingman, a businessman with experience in the oil fields of Pennsylvania, and politician R.B. Bennett, who in less than 20 years will become Canada's 11th Prime Minister. Together they establish the Calgary Petroleum Products Company and build a 25-meter oil derrick over the very spot where Heron discovered the bubbling pool. For 15 months, they drill deeper and deeper, but come up empty.
They were only drilling 3 or 4 feet a day, a meter or so per day, and it was very, very slow work.
When you build a startup, you're wondering every day, am I going to run out of money? Is this going to work? Is this really going to get traction? And there's so much fear.
May 14th, 1914. At a depth of 828 meters, the drill finally breaks through thick rock and strikes an unusually clear oil.
The product that came out of the well wasn't black crude oil like we think of today, which would have needed a refinery, but it was something more like the color of ginger ale. This was very rare. They didn't even have to refine it.
I can imagine the excitement he must have felt knowing that this was going to be a game changer for the West.
Every available barrel is rushed to the site to collect the gasoline. Overnight, Calgary becomes a boom town. 500 new oil and gas companies are registered within 72 hours. Stuart Heron's daring ambition helps develop Turner Valley into Western Canada's first commercial oil field.
Bill Heron was one of those Western kind of bold characters that threw caution to the wind for fortune and prosperity.
Today, Canada is the 5th largest exporter of petroleum products on the planet.
Discovering oil in Canada was an important part of Canadian history because it was, it was a commodity that we needed to build society and to build cities out in the West.
The oil boom opens up Western Canada. Billions of dollars build cities like Calgary, Edmonton, Red Deer, Lethbridge, and Medicine Hat, a modern frontier that helps drive the country's economy. On August 4th, 1914, just 11 weeks after Heron's discovery, the start of World War I gives Canada an unexpected and more solemn boost. With thousands of jobs in war factories, building Allied weapons and military machines. In 1918, war ends. Hundreds of thousands of Canadian soldiers come home to a rude awakening.
When the troops came back from Europe, they were expecting a huge welcome and they were expecting their lives to get better. In fact, there were no jobs. Many of the wartime industries now were closed up. There was desperate poverty, appalling inflation. It was a wretched, wretched situation.
Canada's economy has gone bust. In Winnipeg, the surplus of people looking for work allows employers to keep wages low, less than the rising cost of living. In factories, workers toil in often unsafe sweatshop conditions.
Workers are really at the mercy of a very brutal market. There's very little regulation. This is a very dire condition for people who are trading their labor for wages.
May 15th, 1919. 30,000 Winnipeg workers from private and public sectors walk off the job, including 500 women. With no pay, they and their families need help riding out the strike. Strike organizer Helen Armstrong launches a free meal program that feeds 1,500 people a day. For the last 2 years, as a leader with the Women's Labor League, she's campaigned tirelessly for better working conditions for women.
No movement is successful without women leaders in it. Women have always been there, and women like Helen Armstrong helped to make changes, powerful changes in our lives.
From the beginning, Armstrong also helps recruit more women.
We're coming through. We're here to see those workers.
Male laborers make only $14 a week. Female laborers make $7.
Equal pay for equal work.
Helen Armstrong makes sure that women laborers play a role in the massive strike.
Ladies, come join us. Strike, 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 strike,
By the next day, May 16th, almost every worker in Winnipeg has joined in the strike. Telephone operators walk away from their switchboards, shutting down communication across the city.
It's like the internet suddenly collapsing for us today. You can't talk.
Transportation grinds to a halt.
It moved on to involve police joining the strike. Then the whole sense of authority within the city of Winnipeg seemed to be disappearing. It's chaos, it's anarchy.
The Winnipeg General Strike smolders for over a month.
It wasn't so long since there'd been the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There's absolutely no doubt that Ottawa was convinced that this was the beginning of a revolution.
On Saturday, June 21st, the citywide rebellion boils over. Thousands of strikers make a massive push towards City Hall. One of the largest labor protests in Canadian history, the Winnipeg General Strike, is about to take a violent turn. For 5 weeks, 30,000 Winnipeg workers stand united in a general strike. Helen Armstrong and hundreds of women recruits join angry protesters marching on City Hall.
The perception of the strike on the part of most Canadians was negative. This was seen as a kind of influx of toxic European ideas, of maybe even anarchism. So the strikers and the organizers were vilified.
Drawn towards the crowd is a 14-year-old newspaper boy whose family recently moved here from Scotland. Tommy Douglas, the future father of universal health care.
Tommy Douglas came from what was known as Red Clydeside, Glasgow, centre of labour activity, union activity. His father was a strong supporter and believer in the importance of the working man.
Douglas watches as the crowd gets increasingly unruly.
It is illegal for groups larger than 15 people to...
Mayor Charles Gray threatens strikers with the Riot Act.
You must vacate the area within 30 minutes or face the consequences.
His words intensify their anger. For Tommy Douglas, it's time to find safer ground. From up high, Douglas observes city authorities call in the Northwest Mounted Police. Most Winnipeg policemen are supporting the strikers. 2,000 special constables have been hired by local businesses as muscle.
They were provided with horses and baseball bats. It was a directly confrontational move.
Helen Armstrong and the rest of the protesters stand their ground.
What Douglas saw was people willing to defend with their bodies the right to be treated properly, the right to be treated with respect.
It's an intriguing question to ask, what is it that motivates people to put their lives at risk? There are individuals that do that, and you simply have to look at them with gratitude that they exist.
Suddenly, it turns very violent.
Most of the mounted policemen are shooting into the air. But some of them shoot into the crowd.
I think you feel an incredible sense of horror that this could happen. Because they want rights that everyone should have.
2 strikers die. At least 30 more are injured. 80 are arrested. Helen Armstrong is locked up for inciting violence. June 21st, 1919, is now remembered as Bloody Saturday.
The Winnipeg General Strike was the first really serious labor unrest in Canada. There'd never been a clash like this before.
Helen Armstrong will spend 4 days in jail. Organizers end the strike in fear of more violence.
Right? We're going to go out and give them food.
Armstrong continues to be a powerful voice in the labor movement. In 1921, she helps women win the right to a minimum wage in Manitoba, 10 years before male workers.
I want my girls to know about women like Helen Armstrong. I want us to really honor the work that women have brought to various movements, including the Winnipeg General Strike.
Strike now! Strike now! Strike!
To be able to continue on in the face of adversity has always been the thing that has defined us as Canadians. That no matter how hard things get, that no matter how tough the environment, that no matter how sort of rocky the path, that we continue on.
The Winnipeg General Strike inspires Tommy Douglas to enter politics 16 years later, devoting his life to social justice. In 1944, he's elected the Premier of Saskatchewan.
He was the first socialist premier in North America.
But it balks at any measures of social security.
Douglas champions bargaining rights for workers and the first universal health care program on the continent.
Tommy Douglas helps to create the notion of what Canadian value is.
He reminded people that nobody was more human than any other, and that's what his legacy is for us.
We have our problems. Every country does. Every family has its problems. On balance, though, I think the average person from anywhere in the world stands a better chance of prospering in Canada than they do anywhere.
But 8 years before the general strike, Toronto has its own social problems. Between 1871 and 1911, its population explodes from 56,000 to more than 350,000 residents. Many are new immigrants, Chinese, Italians, Eastern European Jews, who came here to find work and a better life. Desperately poor, they settle where the rent is cheapest, in Toronto's most notorious slum, St. John's Ward. More than 11,000 new Canadians are crammed into a half-square kilometer that today centers on Nathan Phillips Square and the new City Hall.
The people who are living mostly in overcrowded tenements, slum buildings, 5-6 to a room.
The people who are living there want to make a new life for themselves. They're entrepreneurial, they work in factories, they own their own businesses. They're trying to save, they're trying to move out.
The city is a breeding ground for deadly disease. Every year, typhoid, diphtheria, and other infectious diseases claim almost 6,000 residents. But in the spring of 1911, one man is trying to stop the death toll and clean up Toronto and the ward. Dr. Charles Hastings, the city's new medical officer of health.
He sees that if you want to create viable cities, you need to have standards of ventilation, sanitation, healthcare regulations.
It was part of a bigger program, a broader program to kind of generally make the city a safer place to live.
Hastings knows that typhoid and diphtheria are contracted through basic staples like milk and water.
Tainted milk affected people because it was unpasteurized, and tainted milk is something that causes death. They died at very high rates.
When you come to a new country, you don't envision that you're going to land in a place that is as bad or even in some ways worse than where you came from.
He and his department inspect more than 1,600 houses in the ward, gathering data. The Mine Garden family is one of them. Polish-Jewish immigrants. 5 adults and 4 children share the same cramped dwelling.
It must have been very, very difficult for them to look around and feel like they could not take care of their children. As a parent, it must actually tear at your soul, at your spirit.
Annie Meingarten loses her 2-month-old son to gastroenteritis, likely from contaminated milk. 8 years ago, Hastings watched his own daughter die from bad milk. He's determined to stop the death toll. Dr. Charles Hastings is trying to save Toronto residents from deadly infections, especially in its worst slum, the ward. Here, many have no indoor plumbing or toilets. Most are forced to drink from wells near open latrines. Hastings knows the city needs safe running water and a proper sewage system. First, he needs to convince its influential middle class. Toronto's wealthy have turned a blind eye to the slum growing at the city's core.
That's usually how it happens, that people can coexist with others who are drastically less well off than them. They don't see them.
Hastings enlists Arthur Goss, the city's official photographer, to gather evidence.
An image will bring home the suffering of humanity, and people can connect to that and say, oh my God, that could be like my child. And it's the most powerful tool, I think, for us to connect with one another.
Photography is still a relatively new phenomenon. It was expensive. Most people didn't have access to it themselves.
Hastings showcases Goss's photos at exhibitions across the city, shocking the influential middle class.
There's a kind of implicit call on the rest of the citizens to acknowledge that this is a reality and to be part of the responsibility for it.
Hastings' plan works. Living conditions in the ward are now among City Hall's top concerns. By 1918, Hastings has outdoor toilets replaced in favor of indoor plumbing. Toronto becomes the first city in Canada to pasteurize milk.
Hastings' health reforms were remarkable, and the rates of diphtheria and tuberculosis became among the lowest in the world.
Annie Meingarten, who lost her son to a viral infection, goes on to have 2 more healthy children.
Dr. Charles Hastings was the first one who brought to public consciousness how important sanitary conditions were in a big city. And that changed things for the entire country. And I think we owe him a debt of gratitude for that.
Compassion allows our immigrant population to grow and prosper, transforming Toronto into the most multicultural city in the world.
We have a kind of model of a democracy which is very unique in the world. The thing about Canada is it's so diverse, so what are you reflecting? And I would say Canada is reflecting the world.
Toronto quietly triumphs. And 540 kilometers east in Montreal, the party is on.
In the 1920s, Montreal was Canada's metropolis. It was Canada's largest city. It was also its largest port, which at the time rivaled New York.
It's also a boomtown, where the fun never stops.
I mean, there were more night spots and strip joints, whorehouses, than there were days of the year. Everything was open 24 hours.
In 1924, Montreal is the only place in Canada where alcohol can be legally made, sold, and consumed in public. Everywhere else in the country, it's strictly rationed and controlled. Prohibition has Canada in its grip.
Prohibition was meant to get people to stop drinking and create a more moral society. Much of public opinion was for prohibition, but in Quebec, public opinion was very much against it.
Montreal has always kind of zigged when the rest of the country zagged. You know, it's what's called an open city.
The United States has been legally dry since 1920, and Montreal draws in thousands of U.S. visitors each year looking for a good time.
A lot of Americans would come to dance, to drink, to have fun. We were the only place around where alcohol was legal. So obviously that created a sort of attraction.
I think that's one of the things that distinguishes, I guess, French-Canadian culture at the time, is the fact that, it was a bit like in France. People were more sensuous. People liked to have fun.
Alcohol brings in 20% of the government's annual tax revenue. Its economy is on fire. But the party has a dark side. Bootleggers. Every year, millions of liters of Canadian whiskey, beer, and other spirits are smuggled into the U.S. and the rest of Canada
Trafficking alcohol is what permitted criminals to become very organized. It's from this time that we start really talking about organized crime.
Montreal, Canada's economic engine, is being taken over by the underworld. (1924). Montreal, North America's biggest party town, attracts some of society's worst elements. Bootleggers, run by Canadian and American mobsters.
Montreal had a lawless, crazy history, particularly when it comes to liquor. They were selling this to absolutely everybody and lying, cheating, and making a fortune doing it.
To stop the illegal tide of booze into the United States, Ottawa hires Joseph Bissaillon, a tough, streetwise government agent. His boss is Canada's Minister of Customs and Excise, Jacques Bureau.
Écoute, Bureau, il y a environ 2 bateaux par semaine qui se rendent sur l'île de Montréal.
Bissaillon has been tipped off to a huge ongoing smuggling operation right in the port of Montreal.
Montreal was Canada's largest port, and as such, it was the ideal place to be able to ship liquor out to other countries.
All of the sexy sort of stuff that they talk about in The Untouchables and The Godfather, well, behind every one of those stories is somebody in Montreal.
November 1924, Montreal Harbor. Bissaillon heads in for the bust. Officers with the Provincial Liquor Commission lead the charge. Their targets are 2 of New York's most prominent bootleggers, Benny Chicago Stewart and Joe Gorilla Campbell, who are smuggling more than 60,000 liters of alcohol.
We're going to make a fortune tonight. Hey, don't worry, Captain, we got all of it. Whoa. Put your hands up. Wait a minute.
Bravo, les gars. Allez, je m'en occupe.
Bissaillon was the top customs official at the Port of Montreal, so he said, no, I'll take care of this in the name of the federal government.
But Bissaillon is not the upstanding lawman he appears to be.
There was an immense amount of corruption happening with customs officials on both sides of the border. This was a way to strike it rich.
Bissaillon's crooked deeds go beyond illegal booze.
Bissaillon would smuggle alcohol out of Canada, and he would smuggle in stolen goods such as stolen cars or counterfeit clothing or cigarettes. Canadian manufacturers were very much being undercut by a lot of the counterfeit goods that were coming in from the US. And so they hired their own investigator to follow around Bissaillon and collect evidence on him.
The Quebec police bring him in for questioning.
They found that his bank account contained $65,000, which is equivalent to about $1 million today.
Investigators discover that Bissaillon has been operating with the blessing of his boss, the Minister of Customs and Excise, Jacques Bureau. But then, in a shocking twist, the corruption goes beyond Bureau. He and Bissaillon walk away scot-free.
Because what they called systematic corruption, they were let off, which was not uncommon at that time. Many smugglers escaped with little more than a slap on a wrist.
But public pressure eventually brings down the reigning Liberal government and kickstarts a massive cleanup of crime and corruption in Montreal.
The arrival of all of the liquor tourists in Montreal really made Montreal very much a tourist city.
Montreal's nightlife is just legend, you know, it's always been that way. New York's one of those towns, London's one of those towns. Montreal is very much one of those towns.
The party ends October 29th, 1929. The U.S. stock market crashes. The Great Depression slows Canada's Sin City. But in the prairies, an economic crisis triggers a struggle for survival.
The Canadian prairies were hit more badly by the Depression than any other area in North America. The price of wheat plummeted. Farmers couldn't sell it.
The prairies are hit by a devastating drought, the worst in 300 years.
This terrifying drought meant that they couldn't even plant the next crop because the topsoil was all blowing away.
Without topsoil, roots simply can't hold.
The winds would come, would literally pick up their soil and blow it away, and what seeds they had planted would be blown away with it.
The harsh conditions force more than 250,000 prairie farmers to abandon their land.
There are terrifying stories, in fact, of sort of families committing suicide because there was nothing between them and starvation.
Summer 1937. Drought and depression have ravaged prairie agriculture. Near the village of Elstow, Saskatchewan, farmer James Rugg is struggling to get by.
I imagine James Rugg would have been incredibly desperate at this point in time. He would have felt this despair and I think a deep, deep fear for his future.
He and his family have refused to call it quits. And now, they are forced to face down one of Canada's most devastating natural disasters. Dust storms. Summer 1937. Elstow, Saskatchewan. Farmer James Rugg and his family are caught in the path of a vicious dust storm, triggered by extreme drought.
During the time of drought, the dirt itself gets blown away in dust storms that turn the whole sky black.
This one travels at 80 kilometers an hour.
A dust storm is a frightening event. Dust is so fine. It comes right through the windows in your house, around the cracks in the doors. And it actually silts everything up. To have a dust storm come along meant the end of their livelihood for that year.
With every new storm, whatever meager crops farmers still have are scoured away to nothing.
The land is an extension of you. It is the thing that provides for your family and for your livelihood. And to have that kind of fail you would be devastating.
2,900 kilometers from the prairies, at the Experimental Farm Service in Ottawa, Professor Lawrence Kirk is trying to save farmers like James Rugg. He's been hired by the Canadian government to develop unique strains of grasses and grains that can thrive even in extreme drought.
If he could somehow figure out a way to keep his soil from blowing away and stay there during tough times as well as good times, that would be a great success.
Kirk has developed a super seed, fairway-crested wheatgrass. With unusually long roots, it can anchor the soil, preventing the erosion that causes powerful dust storms. Kirk travels 2,900 kilometers to Saskatchewan, where farmers will test his new seed. Eventually, he lands at the farm of James Rugg. And the Canadian prairie will never be the same. Kirk gives Rugg the latest version of the Fairway seeds.
Fairway wheatgrass. Fairway. I want you to plant it, and we'll check back next year and see how she did.
But they never anticipated the hottest, driest summer on record, followed by one of our coldest winters. Spring 1938. A year after planting the seeds, Rugg's regular crops are still struggling. Except for the fairway-crested wheatgrass. It's actually flourished. Fairway is a game changer.
The fairway grass proved that it could grow where it was dry and cold.
It gave them a way to preserve the soil from blowing away and to be a constant and steady crop during good years and bad years.
This one invention literally changed the landscape of the prairies.
Through the boom and bust of the early 20th century, Canadians learned that our survival depends on a collective effort in tough times. Our nation's prosperity is defined by gathering strength around a common purpose. And now, that strength will be put to the ultimate test as Canada prepares to rise united, to defeat the greatest evil the world has ever known.